This is Christian Book Blurb, brought to you by author and songwriter Matt McChlery. Get a behind-the-scenes glimpse into the lives of some of your favourite Christian authors, hear about their books and faith. Also, why not check out my website, mattmcclery.com. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Christian Book Blurb podcast. I'm your host, Matt McChlery, and it's fantastic that you have joined us again for another episode. Today I'm speaking to the author Eric Schumacher, who is going to be speaking to us about his new book called Hours, A Biblical Comfort for Men Grieving Miscarriage. On the 15th of October, it is Miscarriage Awareness Day. This episode is coming out a little bit before that, but hopefully on or around the 15th of October, you will be able to find this podcast and give it a listen, because I know that our conversation is going to be a really important one around a really important topic. So thank you for joining us, and let's welcome onto the show Eric Schumacher. Hi, Eric.
Hey, Matt. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. As I mentioned at the opening of the show, we're going to be speaking about your new book called Hours, Biblical Comfort for Men Grieving Miscarriage. Can you just tell us what it's about and how you hope it can be used?
Sure. It's Hours is a 31-day devotional resource that's designed for men who are walking through grief after a miscarriage. And it walks through the Gospel of Luke in 31 days. It's designed for men to read a portion of Luke each day, and then I answer, or at least address each day, a question that men face when they're walking through miscarriage, and try to answer that from the life of Jesus, so that as they walk through this difficult experience, they can walk through it with Christ, with our Lord, and see his heart for those who suffer, and how the scriptures might apply to that loss. And so I hope it's used by men who are grieving, and I hope it's used by their friends and their pastoral care to sort of understand the experience and know how to provide some biblical hope.
So before we get into your book about men and miscarriage, I believe there's a companion book that runs alongside it, which is aimed at women in miscarriage by the author Abby Wedgeworth, and her book is called Held, 31 Biblical Reflections on God's Comfort and Care in the Sorrow of Miscarriage. Is that right? Am I understanding that these are both companions to each other?
Yeah, that's correct. The Good Book Company had published Abby's book, Held, and she'd asked me to contribute a brief testimony on the husband's experience with miscarriage. And so when I got my contributor's copy from them, it was so well done. I was just very impressed. It's a wonderful volume, and I wrote them and said, you really need to produce a volume that's aimed at men, because as far as I know, there isn't a resource for men experiencing miscarriage. And I added, I'd like to write it. And so they agreed and allowed me to.
Yeah, well, I must admit, when I saw that your book was coming out, that's what really intrigued me and drew me to it, really, is that it's a topic that applies to both men and women, but yet because of the sort of the women's unique position in the process of miscarriage, I suppose there are resources and things out there, but yes, you're right. The sort of the male element is left out of the sort of the support and things that are needed around such a sensitive topic. So you've already mentioned that you used the Gospel of Luke to help you work through some of these things in the devotional. Why did you choose Luke?
Well, a couple reasons. The first is that I know, men in general when it comes to Christian books, women are the primary readers. At least here in the States, men don't read often. And so I figured if I'm getting them to pick up one book to read, I want them to come face to face with Jesus. And the second is because Jesus is, in the Gospels, he is such a friend of sufferers, and he himself suffers. And so we get to see both those things, which I think is a great comfort in our own suffering, that Jesus loves people who suffer. And Luke, one of the things that attracted to me, I'll start over there. And with Luke, one of the things that attracted me to it is just its beginning, the way that Luke starts with a couple who is barren. It starts with infertility, with Zechariah and Elizabeth not able to have children. And Luke specifically notes that they are a righteous couple in regards to the law. And so there is a comfort there that pregnancy loss and infertility struggles are not a result of sin or a curse on people. And then we have these scenes with John the Baptist in the womb and Jesus in the womb, and it begins with the Lord's interest in what's going on in the womb and with little children. And so it's a good reminder that the Lord is very much interested in these things, even though they are unseen to us and to most of the watching world. They are not unseen to the Lord.
Yes, I could see how those topics start to feed into what you're talking about in your book. Yeah, really good. You speak honestly and openly about miscarriage from a position of experience. What can you share with us about your experiences of miscarriage?
Well, my wife and I experienced 4 miscarriages. Each was at a different point in the pregnancy, and that illustrates to me just how every miscarriage is unique. Every miscarriage story is different. And I feel like I had a number of experiences along the way that highlighted to me what men go through in different ways and how men are often overlooked in this journey. And so, one quick example is, for one of our miscarriages, my wife needed to be admitted to the hospital. They induced labor to deliver the baby after the miscarriage. And so we were there for a few days, and it was interesting to me to notice how, because we didn't have a living baby, the father wasn't considered a patient, wasn't given an identity bracelet. And so every time that I had to leave the ward and be readmitted, I had to explain my situation again, which brought some embarrassment and just sort of made you relive the experience. They didn't deliver meals to the room for the father, and so I had to go to this little cafeteria that was provided for the dads in the labor and delivery ward. And so you all arrive at the same time to pick up your food because it's only open for a short time. And all the dads are in there sharing pictures and talking about what they had, a baby boy or a girl. And then all of a sudden the attention turns to you because you're the one that hasn't shared yet. And they ask you what you had. And you feel like you're the one who introduces this sadness into this room full of joy, and you want to shrink back and sort of disappear. And so, those are just little examples that happened in the hospital, but the same thing is true outside the hospital. Even just returning to church, for obvious reasons, there's so much attention on the mother, and there should be, because she's the one who has physically gone through this experience. But often the only questions a man might get is, how is the mother doing? How's your wife doing? Do you need any help? but no one is checking in to see how your heart is and how you're doing walking through this, which can leave you feeling a bit unseen and alone, and wondering if your feelings are even legitimate.
Mm-hmm. That leads me nicely on to the next question I was going to ask you, which is, how do you deal with the societal tendency to ignore miscarriage or to even pretend that it hasn't even happened? I mean, here in the UK, my wife and I, from personal experience, we experienced an ectopic pregnancy, and we know friends who've had several miscarriages, and depending on the time of when it happens in the pregnancy, so one of our friends, it was 2 days before the certain number of days required for it to be acknowledged that it was alive, and so they weren't allowed to bury their child. They weren't allowed to have the child's body to grieve or have a funeral or anything. That it's not allowed because it's not considered alive in the medical term. And so what do you do with that? And then also you've got this whole social thing. I'm not sure about in the in America, but here especially, where couples who are trying to get pregnant keep everything quiet. They don't tell anybody until at least sort of the first trimester has happened, because that's the time where the most problems could occur. And then from then on, the percentage of things going wrong, reduces a lot. And so only then do they sort of let family and friends know that, hey, guess what, we're pregnant. Which my wife and I found really difficult, because you want to share the joy with people that you're pregnant. And actually, if something were to go wrong, well, if people know that, then that's actually a good thing, because people can support you and people can come around you and understand what's going on, rather than, oh, well, we'll just keep it quiet just in case something goes wrong and then we never have to speak of it. And to me, that's really sad. So how do you deal with all of this societal stuff going on around this sort of almost taboo subject of miscarriage?
That's a great question, Matt, and I'm sorry to hear about your experience and your wife's experience with that pregnancy loss. That is difficult, and I think you've hit upon one of the main issues that we deal with miscarriage and pregnancy loss, is this matter of, if it's not talked about, then it raises the question of whether it's a legitimate loss, whether it's a legitimate thing to talk about. And here in the U.S., I think the first time I ever heard about miscarriage was when I was a teenager, probably in the early 90s. And then I didn't hear about it again until I went off to seminary, maybe 5, 6, 7 years later. And one of my theology professors, Dr. Russell Moore, spoke about he and his wife's multiple miscarriages. And it was the first time I'd ever heard of anybody speaking publicly about miscarriage, particularly a man speaking about it. And here in the U.S. for a long time, it was something that you did not talk about. In fact, when my wife and I shared about one of ours, my mom was sharing with my great aunt, who was like a grandparent to me, lived next door to us. And she shared with my mom that she had experienced 5 miscarriages. And, she was born in the early 1900s. And they never had any living children. But if I'm remembering correctly, she had not, that was the first time she'd shared with anybody. And she was in her 90s. And I just thought, wow, how difficult to walk through life having miscarried 5 times, and probably several people knowing, but it's not talked about. And so they know, you probably know that they know, but what can you say? And it's, what you said, I think gets so, just hits it right on the head, that when we don't share in case something happens, then we can't share when something happens, or at least we don't, because that's the reason we were staying quiet anyway. And so then we have to suffer alone. And miscarriage is hard to share anyway, because, the mother is the most acquainted with the pregnancy, simply because she's the one who is pregnant. Her body's gone through all these changes. She's aware every day that there's a child inside of her. And then there's the father, who is mentally preparing, for what life with this child is going to be like, and maybe setting up a nursery and going to appointments and those sorts of things. But then when we tell other people, they begin to anticipate it, but they don't anticipate on the same level that we do, even if they're happy for us. They, maybe grandparents, but or other children, but otherwise they're happy for us, and they think about it every now and then when they see us. But when the loss comes, even for those who know, it's still not as acute of a loss as it is for the parents right there, because they haven't lived with the development of this child. But if you remove any knowledge of that from the equation, then our friends in our church are finding out about the pregnancy at the same moment they're finding out about the miscarriage, and it's they haven't even rejoiced over the news to be able to begin to mourn it. And I think I think that's something that needs to change, and I know here in the U.S. it's begun to change. There's a lot more conversation about miscarriage, many more resources about miscarriage coming out. Sadly, well, it's a good thing, that they're coming out, but many of them are designed simply for the woman. And anytime the father is mentioned, it's sort of how you can care for your wife, for the mother, and which is good, because men need to know that, but men also need to know how to process this loss and how to grieve it. And sometimes we feel selfish about that, because the mother's going through these physical changes in the miscarriage. She might be experiencing some pain. She might have to have medical procedures performed. She's recovering from that. And it can feel selfish to bring up her own grief. But really, when the father is processing his loss well, their loss well, he's in a much better place to care for her. And that's why I encourage men to talk about it. Plus, I just encounter, as a pastor, I encounter a lot of women who, one of their questions is, I don't know if my husband's okay. He's not sharing anything. Or I feel like I'm grieving this loss by myself. I feel like I'm alone in this because he's not talking about it. And I think the more we can begin to talk about it, our Lord processed his grief in public, at the tomb of Lazarus. And we don't need to be afraid to follow in his footsteps.
It's great that your book helps men to start to grieve the loss. But in America, is there opportunity to grieve the loss? I mean, we lost our little one really early on. But, are funerals allowed? Those kind of questions. Because I know in the UK, like a movement has started. I don't think it's a Christian movement either. It's one that sort of goes around the country, visiting all the different cathedrals. And basically, it just says, if you've had a miscarriage or something of that nature and haven't had the opportunity to say goodbye, come along. And, and they have ways of helping people to process the loss and sort of giving permission to couples to actually grieve, where permission hasn't really been given before. So is that different in America? Are you allowed to have a funeral or something like that, or is it similar to the UK?
Yes, you are allowed. So with one of ours, the miscarriage was at a point, and because my wife was able to deliver, a little baby, fit in the palm of our hands. We were able to have a funeral home pick up the baby's remains, and which they will do even if you have to have a procedure to remove the baby where the body isn't whole. You can have them pick it up, and they often have baby sections in our cemeteries here, and you can arrange to have a funeral done and a burial done. And I've done one of those funerals, just a private family ceremony for a friend of mine. And then we just had a family ceremony on our own. We didn't invite anyone, but it was just us and our living children at the graveside. And I would, that's sad to hear you say that. I hadn't heard of that before, where it's not allowed to have a funeral. And is that a state thing or a church thing?
It's a state thing, because it's to fit in with abortion laws and that kind of thing,
yeah.
And so it's all that kind of stuff going on in the background, which then ties the hands of the authorities and things. After a certain point, you can have a funeral, but it's sort of before that point,
yes,
where all those other things come into play.
I would encourage those listening who may walk through miscarriage or have even had one to, and I imagine it differs according to church tradition. I'm a Baptist pastor, and so being Baptist and being American, we have the mindset of we can do whatever we want. But I would encourage you to ask if you could even have a memorial service, because I think it's worth honor. Every life is made in the image of God, even if we never saw the body, and it's worth honoring that loss and that person, because the Lord does. The Lord honors them as a valuable person created in His image, and I would encourage pastors to always offer. Some parents will be uncomfortable with that or won't want it, but to always offer, is there anything you'd like to do in terms of a service? Even if there's no body to be buried, I think that's a good blessing. And what you mentioned about abortion laws and all that complicates things so much in terms of public mourning. Several years ago, after we returned from the doctor's office of the hospital after one of the miscarriages, I needed to run out to pick up a medication prescription for my wife. And so I got into my car and turned it on and had the radio on. It was public radio on, and they were interviewing a politician from our state who was discussing some pro-abortion legislation that was being debated at our state capitol at the time. And he was defending it. It was allowing abortion up to a certain point. And he said, I don't know what the big deal is. I don't know why people would be upset. It's only, abortion up to this many weeks in the pregnancy. And well, it was the same number of weeks as our child. And so he had basically just dismissed our child as it's only, as this didn't count as a life, and it wasn't really important. And that caused a bit of anger in my heart. And right now, with the Supreme Court ruling here in the U.S. about Roe v. Wade, and abortion is a very public discussion and debate right now, and even among Christians. And the things that I read and see on social media or that I hear on the radio, I don't think people think about how they land on a couple or a parent that has walked through a miscarriage. Even Christians, I think, who are trying to sympathize with those who choose to have an abortion, which I think we want to be gentle and compassionate and, want to minister to people, but even the ways they speak about those abortions can sometimes come across in a way that really devalues or diminishes the worth of a life at that stage in the pregnancy. And if you are a parent who has walked through a miscarriage or is at the moment experiencing that, particularly if you're in a place where miscarriage isn't talked about much and the conversation about abortion is becoming very heated, it's going to be very hard to speak up and to say anything, and it can create wounds that could end friendships and cause division and hurt in the church. I think it's something we need to think very carefully about. And one of the reasons I've chosen there's several reasons I've chosen to speak publicly about miscarriage, but I think one of them is our culture needs to come face to face with this is a child, and I'm grieving, and you're not going to stop me from grieving. And you need to understand that some of your arguments are telling me that my grief is illegitimate and I shouldn't be sorrowful. And I think part of our Christian witness is to stand up in the face of that and say, no, I'm going to weep at the tomb like Jesus did with Lazarus. And you need to think about that because this isn't a small thing. We're dealing with a human being created in the image of God.
Yes, it's a big and difficult thing, all of it.
It is.
Just coming back to your book, you've got some really useful features in there. It's not just a devotional. Yes, you read the bits and you explain how it kind of fits into the life of Jesus. There's a Bible verse at the start of each day. You've also got a prayer in there each day to help people, and a bit of journaling space as well. So I guess I quite like it. It's quite a well-rounded tool to help people process and work through their grief in the light of miscarriage. We'll be coming back to speak a bit more with Eric Schumacher in just a moment.
If you enjoy listening to this podcast, you can help keep it on the web. All you've got to do is buy me a coffee. Head over to buymeacoffee.com/Matt McChlery to make a donation. There is a link in this episode's show notes. So go on, buy me a coffee today and help this podcast to keep supporting Christian books and authors.
Welcome back. I am chatting with the author Eric Schumacher, who has written his book called Ours, A Biblical Comfort for Men Grieving Miscarriage. Now, Eric, we've spoken quite a lot about miscarriage and about your book, but one of the things we like to do here on the Christian Book Blurb is to find out a little bit more about the author behind the scenes or behind the pen. Who is Eric Schumacher? I notice your name is spelt like you would say Michael Schumacher, the Formula One driver, yeah. But you say Schumacher. Are you related at all?
Oh, I wish. My middle name is Michael, and so my oldest son in the last year or two has become a very big fan of F1 racing, and so he's a fan of Mick. And I think he'd like me to go by my middle name, so at least on paper it looks the same. But maybe if he gets into racing, that we'll start doing
that. What do you have another job? Is being an author and writing books all you do?
Oh,
or do you do other things?
Yeah, my full-time job is I am a pastor here at a church in Iowa in the United States, and so that's my full-time employment. I've written 3 other books beside this, and really enjoy writing. I would love to write full-time if I could, but I would need to sell a lot of copies of some book at some point to be able to afford that. I also co-host a podcast called Worthy with an American author, Elise Fitzpatrick, and the podcast is about celebrating the value of women in the world, the church, and the home. And so we have interviews with all sorts of fascinating women from around the world. Some people may have heard of, and most of which people haven't. But it's a delight to see what God is doing through some of our sisters around the globe.
That sounds really fascinating. How about favorite things?
Oh,
Do you have a favorite thing to eat or favorite thing to watch?
favorite things. Well, I'm a big fan of the country music artist Johnny Cash, and so I'm a bit of a fanatic when it comes to that, and tend to be known for that among my friends. So I love his music.
I've got his album Walk the Line. I really like that
Oh
one.
yes,
That's really
yes. Well, I love his life. His story is fascinating and a great story of redemption. I don't know if I have a favorite food, but fish and chips is if I can get those in a good authentic pub, then I'm going for that with some malt vinegar. That's good.
Oh, great. Oh, you'd fit right in here in the UK.
Oh.
We love our fish and
I would
chips.
love to come have some of the real thing in the real place.
Have you got anything coming up? As you say, you've written some other books in the past. Have you got something in the pipeline? Is there another Michael Schumacher book coming out soon?
There's not. I have a proposal in to an author that we're going to have some conversations about here soon. And I have another that I'm working on, but there's no contract signed. I'm in an odd place where I don't have any projects to work on right now. So I'm trying to figure out what to do with my time.
Coming on podcasts like this, obviously.
Yes, yeah. We have 5 children in the home between 10 and 20, so there's always something to do.
Yeah, that will keep you busy, that's for sure. That's excellent. And so if people want to find out more about you or more about your books, have you got social media or a website that people can look at, that kind of thing?
Yeah, my website is emschumacher.com. And as you mentioned, Schumacher is spelled like Schumacher, Schumacher. And so EM Schumacher, that's my handle on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all the socials. So I love to connect with people on there. I'm quite active on Twitter and sometimes Instagram, and I try to avoid Facebook for my sanity. And so
Yeah, that's great. Just for those listening, we will be putting a link to Eric's website in the show notes or the description. Wherever you are listening to this podcast, whatever platform you're on, you should be able to find that and then click your way over there from that point. So do have a look out for those. Well, thank you, Eric, for joining me today. It's been a heartfelt discussion. I've enjoyed it, and it's given me a lot to think about and pray about as well. And yes, if you know someone who has experienced miscarriage recently, or you are going through it yourself, and you know what? Grief works in very strange ways. So it doesn't even have to be a recent thing. It might have been something that happened a really long time ago, but you still need to come to terms with it or process it. Do check out Eric's book called Hours, A Biblical Comfort for Men Grieving Miscarriage, or indeed Abby Wedgeworth's companion book to his called Held, 31 Biblical Reflections on God's Comfort and Care in the Sorrow of Miscarriage. And yeah, I'm sure that will be a blessing to you, or indeed to the people that you give them to. So that just leaves me to say thank you to Eric for joining us on today's podcast. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Thanks for the opportunity to come on and to have this conversation. It's been a pleasure to meet you and share some time with your listeners.
And thank you as well to you for listening to this episode of the Christian Book Blurb. Remember, our show comes out twice a month, so do keep a lookout for it. We interview a wide range of Christian authors that deal with a wide range of topics, both fiction and non-fiction. So do come back again soon for another episode of the Christian Book Blurb. Thanks for listening. Goodbye. Thanks for listening to Christian Book Blurb with your host, Matt McChlery. Do give it a like, give it a share, and let your friends know all about it. We do hope to see you again soon on another Christian Book Blurb.